Stories. There's something ingrained deep into our culture and history, a way to experience things we couldn't directly. After all, that is why a lot of novels, comics, and movies are fairly popular media for consumption. Video games is a bit of an exception in that regard, as stories play second fiddle to the interactivity of gameplay mechanics. That's not to say they're not an important piece of the puzzle, as a bad story can easily detract and damage the experience of a good game. So for this video, I want to take a look at stories of racing games. Take note of how they are executed and handled throughout the games. You'd be surprised at just how diverse and unique some of these game stories can go into. Of course, heavy spoiler warning if you haven't played any of these games. There will be discussions of certain critical plot elements in some of the games you're seeing on screen, so you've been warned. We'll start off with the heavy story hitters, and so far I don't think there's any game that could outmatch Racing Lagoon in this position. I've said this in previous videos, but I'll say it again. Racing Lagoon is more of an RPG with racing mechanics to fit the story themes, effectively replacing what would be combat into short racing events. That pretty much explains the deep story implementation and developments. Where you are in the story will heavily determine what content you have access to, with certain chapters locked into specific maps, so which race events you can do are directed by the story. That's not even accounting for the random drivers we could challenge with the respective loots and shop item rotation, which straight up will dictate which parts you can get only in specific chapters. This approach is quite unique to racing games even today, since a lot of stories and progression are made to strictly only open up more content to play around with. Racing Lagoon has no qualms with making content off limits if you just so happen to progress. This does have its own benefits and issues attached. On the upside, this heavily rewards those with curiosity, letting those players rake in a lot of rare parts and events that could easily go unnoticed to the average player. On the other hand, it's very frustrating to learn of content missed out just because you decided to move on and proceed with the story. Considering this is a very old RPG with no chapter select options, your only viable option is to either save scum or make a save file per chapter. As for its writing, Racing Lagoon's overall narrative starts off pretty slow, but it keeps things interesting, as it fleshes out its world building to introduce this alternative version of Yokohama, where street racing is mostly legal and is something most people, including your average civilian and workers, participate in. The first half of the plot also heavily uses its opportunity to introduce the different unique forks of street racing culture in Japan, working in tandem as a way to unlock and expand on more gameplay features and challenges to tackle. In a way, this is where the writing is at its strongest. With the visuals to accompany these introductions, it gave a lot of ways to introduce each and every single one of these street racing subcultures, which I don't think there's any game with this sheer volume and variety included ever. Oftentimes, these will also come with some character writing. They're kinda hit or miss, but they still help out to flesh out the world building. Regardless of whether or not you get attached to them, it's hard to ignore the variety in writing each of these crews and what keeps them going in the scene. Even some one-dimensional characters that you think will just be the equivalent of a Saturday morning cartoon character get some proper development through the storyline, leaving us with many reactions and development as the scene starts to change. The second half of the game, however, is where you really get reminded who made this game, because someone certainly did not hold the Final Fantasy writers back in the slightest. Sharks will get jumped over with stories of alter egos, evil corporations, drugs, deaths, and plot twists on almost every corner of the game. Some people love this, since this is probably the closest example of a racing game story reaching the JRPG spectrum, but I personally find it to be quite mixed in execution. It takes away from the grounded aspects of Japanese street racing cultures and everything surrounding it. Initially, my impressions of the second half was going to be more about lessons on not taking shortcuts for easy wins. You know, maybe showcasing how it's not just about the car and its parts that could lead to victories, but they definitely went way further than that, so to speak. But this game overall still covers the extreme case of when a story heavily dictates the gameplay and content available. It can outshine the gameplay in certain points, like when the game really kicks off the serious tones. It's a strong motivator to keep the main story going to get more revelations. The other example I've come across closest to Racing Lagoon was this game. This is ChoroQ HG4, and it's probably the only game in the series with some heavily involved stories next to the gameplay. That's not to say there has been one before this, but they're mostly pretty simple and done as a way to platform the gameplay without having an overarching plot following the different characters as the game progresses. In this title, most of the plotline and writing are a bit sparse at first, mostly the light world building from some short cutscenes, dialogues functioning to shape the motivations of the rival characters, and a bunch of small talks with the townspeople for basic information or lore. Initially, the race opponents are mostly random opponents. None of them seem to be the talkative type besides our rival, which also has a random chance of spawning in the race events. You and your rival are nobodies in an ocean of other nobodies. Progress a bit further until we reach team races. Suddenly we have named rivals, yapping away the whole race in order to showcase their personality while in these high-stress race competitions. You can even find these people roaming the city and speak to them to dabble in more conversations or do some side activities, even if most of them are pretty one-note. This is a good way to nail the sense of progressing from basic riding usage. This of course also includes the characters we work with throughout the multiple races and championships, even following along with their insane ideas via the minigame sections. In the process, this story progression also unlocks more content as well, with new town areas, shops, minigame activities, and championships, all in order to reach the second half of the story where suddenly it gets really involved. Multiple town events that are related to the whole championship, certain character situations, and the introduction to the king of the racing scene. And that's just the main progression. ChoroQ games have a habit of adding multiple side objectives to really flesh out the world, with some extra charm and spice things up in the process. HG4 took that idea and ran all the way with certain activities or important features for post-endgame being locked behind them. The townspeople are easily some of the funniest rendition of a car-only town you can find. They're mostly composed of your average daily conversations, some extra lore tidbits for minor world building. These dialogues can really play out really well to teach players about the basics, since, well, most of these guys are the racers we ran across in the events, and that is honestly a pretty cool way to handle minor characterization. No need to put them under a massive spotlight, simply existing around town really helps a lot, which also fleshes out the town next to the bizarre and unique random encounters. So far though, the biggest weakness of the game is from the randomness of these, well, random encounters. Some of them at least have criteria to fill, which may or may not be told by the game. But then you have some of the events that are completely random. So unfortunately, you'll have to spend a lot of time exploring and checking every corner of the town, or have a guide open on the side. Additionally, the lighter story presence in the early game may end up giving people the wrong impressions. You mostly get snippets out of some characters in town and their lives, from both main progression and side content. When the second half kicks in, suddenly a lot of characters get a ton of spotlight and development. It kind of feels sudden and out of left field, especially when we get to a specific character's health condition. And I think the worst part of this story still comes from the mentor character leaving the game permanently after beating the last championship for the base story progression. As far as I'm aware, this is the only point in the game that could permanently block players from achieving 100% completion. I think if this happens way more often, like how Racing Lagoon does it with its chapters, this would feel less like a slap to the face out of nowhere. It's one of those situations where I wish there would be more consistent story effects to the gameplay beyond just simply unlocking new features. They could definitely add more interaction with the rival character early on to build rapport, because the second half of this game is truly one of the biggest roller coasters I've gone through out of the racing games genre. It's not as batshit insane as Racing Lagoons, but it's more of an escalation that works to sell you the idea of being in the big leagues. It's just missing some of the build-up from some characters. How about games that do things in a slightly more streamlined manner? Well, I suppose we have something like Driver San Francisco for something like that. The story follows Officer John Tanner, professional wheelman and former undercover cop, overseeing the arrest of his nemesis from the previous Driver games, Jericho. Of course, since this is the prologue, things go off the rails. Jericho's henchmen try to rescue him out of custody, and he gets his final laugh in the form of a massive car crash. The rest of the game plays out from inside Tanner's comatose mind, with main story events influenced by outside information from either his partner or the TV broadcast, which then gets translated into his mind as some sort of convoluted plan by Jericho. In the process, Tanner has given himself the liberty of some weird funky superpowers like vehicle shifting, manifesting nitrous to any car he's driving, and later the ability to pull off telekinesis. I do like the execution here, since areas of San Francisco are unlocked only when they are relevant thanks to the news reports. So it's clear the play area is entirely based on what Tanner believes to be important and relevant in his mind to piece together Jericho's plan. The remaining focus of the storyline covers Tanner's own fight with his own inner demon in the form of Jericho, which also symbolizes his rivalry to the criminal. At the end, he even showcases just how smart he is by piecing together Jericho's true motives from external information while he's in a coma, letting him not only beat his own situation by sheer willpower, but also showcasing his brain power with the eventual arrest of Jericho in the final act of the story. This is one of those super linear stories containing a ton of layers the more you analyze it. All of the messages it's trying to convey, the subtle character writing, and the symbolism to take away from the overall story and writing. But we've only covered the more serious main storyline here. Being an open world, there's chock full of optional content to dabble inside the mind of Tanner. This is where the more comedic and lighthearted tone of the game comes in. It's almost like Yakuza style of tone setting, where most of the main stories are very serious for the most part, and then every single side content is the most ball-bustingly hilarious piece of fictional writing. You kinda have to question if any of these happenings are things Tanner constantly imagines in his head, or things he's seen in his career as a police officer. And the more wacky setups also let the developers create some freedom to make unique gameplay scenarios, which also happens to make use of the game's unique mechanics to its advantage, showcasing gameplay elements or strategies you'd normally avoid in the main story missions. Either way, this is another good use case of tonal balancing. Tone setting wise though, it's one thing we see dealt constantly within a franchise or series. But what happens when a franchise is defined by popular trends and is handled by an ever-changing rotation of developers? Well, then you get Need for Speed, a franchise that has been around for decades now, and it's constantly altering identity, directly affecting the change in gameplay and storytelling. Every year it's a bit unclear what the next Need for Speed title is going to be, or what it's going to cover, and it sort of became a series that tries to attract different fans of racing subgenres. The furthest they went with their narrative is between two choices, Need for Speed The Run and Undercover. The former is an extremely linear experience, inspired by the Cannonball Run taking place from one end of the USA to the other. The story of The Run follows Jack Rourke and the attempt to win the event, in order for him to get some money, which based on the prologue seems to imply he'll use it to clear off his debts with the Mafia. In the race, he'll meet several named characters he'll race against, and that's it. Despite the game being heavily dictated by the plot or whatever is happening in the story, in terms of substance, it is surprisingly shallow. Most of the named characters don't really have much characterization over the wall of text you'll read during the loading screens. Their behavior isn't really showcased beyond some short cutscenes or intro sequences, which I feel is a missed potential to be had. They could easily use the linear aspect of the game to make specific named rivals behave in ways to affirm their character traits. Not really having any of them interact with Jack in the slightest also makes it weird as to why they're highlighted with personalized names when they ultimately just behave like the other nameless opponents. The only exception to this is Marcus Blackwell. He's often doing dirty things in order to impede Jack's chances of winning, and he kinda showcases you don't really need excess dialogues to make these characters stick. It's kinda funny knowing the bizarre Wii version of the game seems to have way more substance to dig into the story thanks to the comic panel presentation, although that one is hilariously bad for the illogical scenes and over-the-top presentation. Kind of the same issue they ran into with Need for Speed Undercover, the one time where they really tried to push this dramatized undercover cop storyline into street racing. So I guess it's kind of similar to the first Fast and Furious movie. The only problem was with the execution. It's no secret that the game was rushed, resulting in the very mixed quality of the game, so I won't fully blame the developers or writers for this one. It's one of those pieces of writing that seems like it has the skeletons to be pretty well made, but the execution is all over the place. Just look at the performances. There's passion, and then there's this.
I want a rematch, like now. You and me, we finish this now. That's what I'm talking about. That's how we get things done with the cops. Make this happen now. Very
Besides this, I'd probably point to the weird inconsistencies with characters not catching on to the player being an undercover cop, despite wrecking and capturing each member one by one using their personal cars. These problems of execution can really hamper a lot of the stories told, because on a conceptual stage, Undercover sounds like a very interesting story to tell, and it can also be traced in the modern Need for Speed series too. 2015 had good ideas with its character-specific event types, which could have been used to really develop the characters in interesting ways. Instead, most we got was a bit too much of Spike and Monster energy drinks. Payback could have had a darker setting with the whole Vegas-like criminal organization and the multiple crews involved, but nah. We just get some mini Fast and Furious heists and some normal race events. Keats digging into police corruption also could have been way more interesting if they had dug a bit deeper into it instead of focusing on Anna and her self-righteous behavior. There is genuinely something interesting that could be dug up there, there had they put more focus onto it. An Unbound story would have been so much better had Tessa's betrayal and Yaz's character development happened way earlier than week 4, the final week of the game's main career mode. Also, of course, they took way too safe of an approach despite the story being about family betrayals, but that seems to be a running issue with stories since 2015. They tried to tackle ideas and concepts that could be interesting for a racing game, but never really tried to go deeper, just meandering in the safe space without really crossing the line, which goes over to the dialogues, plot lines, and character writing. It wouldn't be so bad if the story actually commits to its points and affects the content accessible in the game, like when Heat made you use the alternative garage for 5 minutes. Can we do that but more? It wasn't really like this back then, but that's probably because people tend to have a more positive reaction to them before. Genuinely, if I ask you about the story and writing of Pro Street and Porsche Unleashed, you'll likely only remember some small pockets from all over the place, due to the stories back then being extremely light for gameplay justification. There are more world buildings if you dig deep enough, but for what the game explicitly shows you, they're kinda just there. In its inception, Need for Speed is a very arcadey experience, so it has the appropriate amount of story to not really mess with the game flow. Back in the first game, most of the story has the most basic premise of racing against your rival, with no development beyond the results screen.
Oh, what's wrong? Does your little waste car driver want to go home? Full throttle, red lining, muffler burning, turbocharging, paint peeling, blistering son of a gun! Welcome to the Wall of Fame! First to the finish and to the victor the spoils. It's all under the hood, man, and you took it over the line, baby, way ahead. Way ahead!
Then it kinda got removed until Porsche Unleashed. The story returned, but it was also pretty light, mostly present to give an excuse to make players go through the historical roster. The tuner era is where things get kicked up a notch, with Underground 1 utilizing 3D rendered cutscenes a lot more often, without adding too much. It's enough to inform players of the characters they'll be dealing with. Underground 2 tries to be a bit more, but also does it by replacing the 3D animations with comic panels instead, which gives it a lot of leeway and freedom to show the scenes from a ton of interesting angles. Besides, the story this time is a bit denser outside of the usual climbing up the ranks storyline. A pinch of mystery and conspiracy running with the so-called gang responsible for our downfall at the start, and it was running pretty good with the gang breaking apart the more we progress. That is, until Caleb showed up. He could have been a good main villain if only they didn't make him into such a chump in both cutscene and gameplay. Now you might be surprised to hear this, but Most Wanted is pretty light in story. The majority of it happens at the prologue and the final leg of the career. The rest, mostly handled by the messages, every plot progression, communication with the Blacklist members, even character building moments with Razor and Cross are done through this method, so there's a ton of reading or listening. We don't even see or directly communicate with most of the Blacklist members. Most we see are their portrait in the Blacklist selection screen, their cars, or their very brief voiceless appearances in the cutscenes, which mostly focuses only on the main characters between Mia, Razor, or Cross. But people seem to remember this game as if it had such a massive story, and if I had to guess, it's primarily thanks to the way it has been presented. As far as I'm aware, this is the first use of a green screen full motion video cutscene. It gives off such a bizarre experience even back then, seeing actors on top of a 3D rendered background based on the game and the extra piss filter on top. It was also more of a showcase for technology progressing back then, since most FMV footage around that time was still using an actual physical stage prop for the environment instead of this wholly digital showcase. Alongside the performances, they're the perfect example of forced coolness that you either cringed to or found funny. They brought a lot of the same ideas for Carbon, but this time, there's way more 3D mocap work going on. It's a good way to hit that sweet spot of having character animations during specific scenes without constantly relying on the FMV sections. And believe it or not, despite the shorter career length, Carbon's story is actually denser than what was in Most Wanted. We get an introduction to each boss after beating our first race in their territory, accompanied by the FMVs, the boss race, and the dual race intro. And that's also on top of our own crew members, their introduction, FMV scenes, and their part in the whole whodunit storyline of who stole the cash, which is where we get to the weak part of the story. Obviously, it's Darius. He's already got that villain aura from the very first appearance we meet him, and unfortunately, most of the mystery seems to only circle around the one scene. You know which one. So there really isn't that much depth to the mystery besides who switched the money bags. The other crew bosses don't really seem like the type to spend their money recklessly, except maybe Wolf.
Thanks for the donation, Wolf TFK.
It may be a bit oversimplified and also over the top with the presentation, but it works. It gives out pretty much everything we need as a motivation, reasoning for having these crew members, and serving the gameplay features on a platter. Pro Street went back to strictly using 3D rendered cutscenes again, but they've also cut down the amount of explicit story in it. Most of the things you'll see are the intro between Ryan and Rio, along with the introduction of the Kings, but only their cars. You never really see anyone else besides the two main characters. Most of the writing is relegated to lore building throughout the announcers in each event.
Wow! Yo, he went and dropped some dough on a brand new M Trace. Cooper, man, you better do that M series some justice. I'm sorry, man, but I just gotta say, it's actually kind of cool to see chunks of a high-precision German automobile like the R32 all over the place. I'm sorry, man. That, ladies and gentlemen, that was incredible. We just watched Bradley Hunter lose it on the strip. I never thought I'd see the day that dude would wipe out. Seriously, I'm gonna bet we'll see him back real soon. And most likely in a Chevelle. He won't drive anything else.
Seriously, that was pretty cool, Rio. Thanks for putting on a little show for the fans out there. We all really appreciate it. Now, you got to tell me about the other drivers today. We got a handful of serious contenders out there. Give us the Showdown Kings perspective. Who's going to take it?
Well, they're all looking pretty good, I guess. You know, I was just telling one of the guys that Chicago really reminds me of this one race I won a couple of years back. We had a couple thousand more people than we have today, but it was real cool because there were 20 other drivers out there. I slotted into the lead in the fourth lap, and once I got in there, I never let go. It was so fun. So, yeah, you know, there's some pretty all right drivers out there today. It's gonna be cool.
What about this Ryan Cooper guy? A lot of people are talking because, you know, he beat your guy at that one race. And...
Hey now, come on, man. Apex Glide didn't get shut down. That's just people talking. I mean, come on, really. Seriously, like whatever his name is just could beat Apex Glide? Give me a break, J-Mac.
Well, but, okay, I'm getting away, but we're gonna have to go. We're gonna have to get to the next deal. So let me just say thanks for swinging by today, Rio. We appreciate it.
They really went all out with this, even if most players often treat them as white noise. But if you want to see how a game really tries to develop its story mostly through lore, then take a look at this one. Every single TXR title never really directly and explicitly gives you details and information regarding each game's story, except for one. Import Tuner Challenge is the only game to really spell out the game's story for you throughout the visual novel-esque dialogues, and that's where the rest differs. Since the first ChoroQ Racer, every single game at the base level always throws players into the gameplay and only the gameplay relevant goals. If you want to understand the stories of the ChoroQ street racing scene, you're gonna have to start reading, like a lot of reading. We're talking about going into each rival's information and personal files, cross-referencing with other rivals to make the connections, and then piecing the whole story together. And that's applicable for each game. So if you're trying to understand what's going on in the whole series in preparation for the new TXR, that's probably going to take weeks or months of non-stop reading. This kind of approach is really cool when done correctly though, letting people that normally don't care about stories in their racing game go on to continue their game, while the rest goes wild melting their own heads, figuring out each rival's connection and how the whole plot comes together in perfect harmony. An example, reading through some of the character bios in early TXR will inform you of what is currently happening, like the power struggle between crews, or if you've played TXR Drift 2 without a care in the world, you might think the appearance of the 13 Devils is unprovoked and these highway racers just decided to invade the Touge scene as just a way to tie them into the Drift spin-off, but you'd be surprised to know they came because of a supposed provocation by the Kingdom 12 leader, the former final boss for Drift 1, all in order to make himself look like a hero for revenge on the current king of the Touge scene, who's supposedly the player character from the first Drift game. And this event leads into the development of what happened to Jintei, the leader of the 13 Devils, falling into depression in the next game. This is only a taste of how deep and intricate the lore of the series can get. You should give them a try, because some of them are pretty interesting to read through. It's not common to find games with intricate lore like this, containing stories of struggles, love, and sometimes just the average goofy nerds trying to make it in the racing scene, which they seem to be trying again in the new TXR, considering in gameplay they will usually inform the reasoning of requirements some of the elusive wanderers seem to have. Now, while this is great for those who care, it does take a lot of manpower to create, even if it's not as direct or important to the game overall. That's why sometimes a racing game can be better off not having any story because the gameplay easily carries it. The early Need for Speed games, Burnout, Grid, Gran Turismo, and Forza Motorsport can easily testify to this choice. These are games with almost no form of storytelling or extremely minimal lore to tell to the players, just you and the gameplay in its entirety. But is that truly the case? Are these games truly without any form of story to tell? Well, let's consider the use of imagination, otherwise known as role-playing. This is the lowest, most accessible way for storytelling to feature in any game ever since. Well, everybody's got their imagination, but it's not an instant win like what most people would believe. To fulfill this, a good execution of gameplay mechanics, pacing, and progression must be met, usually by having limitations, but also give leeway for freedom to let players bypass challenges in any way they see fit. In the case of Burnout, this role-playing aspect kicks in into high gear since they've added the revenge mechanic, letting you build a rivalry with any opponent who dares to send you into the Shadow Realm and vice versa. It's a simple mechanic, but its inclusion into the game is genius. Players can craft this epic rivalry with any AI opponent in any race on the fly and let us shift the race organically. It gets expanded once we cross over to Gran Turismo or Forza. The role-playing aspect from these two series comes from the setting of starting from the very bottom and rising to the top, by tackling each race and championship any way you see fit. Gran Turismo, at least the early ones, only using license test classification as the true hurdle to enter these events, lets anyone go after whichever event they want, and the vehicle limitation being quite lenient for the majority of events also lets players choose how to tackle the upcoming challenges. The opportunity to create tales of brand loyalties, nationalism struggles, and sometimes LARPing as a team manager. I'd even pinpoint to the replacement of the system being the biggest letdown for Gran Turismo 7, besides the online-only crap and economic nonsense. The menu book completely erases the depth of player expression we once had to create these stories and replaces it with an extremely limited linear experience. Look, I can somewhat appreciate the attempt at teaching people historical and development information for cars, especially for the car nerds out there, but it shouldn't have to come at the cost of being handcuffed into a railroad like this. At the very least, they could have done something like Race Driver Grid. It's pretty freeform like the older GT games, but still has some level of structure like Forza's level system in a sense. What gives this game an edge is with how deep and expansive the mechanics are. You're effectively building a racing team as both the manager and driver, giving you the option of choosing and purchasing both vehicles and drivers for the team. It's just from how they're handled and featured that makes everything just a bit more immersive than it should have been. And this could create some intense made-up drama in our head. As the team rises, drivers replace, and cars pile up. I would argue this approach is far more effective at creating suspenseful moments when the decision is handed over to the player. The weight of choices even for something as mundane as choosing which used vehicle to buy is a whole lot more impactful than the average dialogue choices in a cutscene heavy storyline. This is me saying as much as I like some of the things they did in Grid Legends, it's just nowhere near as good as the possible results that could have come out of the team manager simulator we've had in the first Grid. There are some examples of games that try to do both, but their execution can be quite lacking or very limiting. This is something of a rarity, and I don't really think it's as popular due to the very obvious flaw. So the F1 games usually have two forms of stories to tell. The first is the player-oriented career mode. You can also choose to be a manager, actively nudging the team development from the facilities, R&D, personnel, and finances, or just handle the driving side of this content. Obviously, because you drive only F1 cars, it gets a bit limited after a while and just becomes a number goes up game. Of course, this doesn't heavily limit the more role-playing aspect for its story. You can still cook up that rivalry for whichever driver you have a hate boner on for whatever reason. The other one is Breaking Point, a fictional story following a set of original characters next to the existing F1 drivers and teams. A storyline by Codemasters that seems to be getting new developments every 2 years or so, where we get to see how each character has changed and developed over the seasons. The only thing is, there's not really that much room for interpretation from the gameplay standpoint. Like, some of the interview dialogue choices are neat, but it doesn't really take much to realize just how awfully linear and scripted the story is. In other words, none of the dialogue choices have any impact on the story direction. This in part accelerated the thought process for people to realize Breaking Point is effectively just a tutorial for the actual game with extra steps. I can see this working as a way to keep players with minimal or no interest in Formula 1. I mean, if people got swept into the sport by Drive to Survive, then surely some made-up drama could also work for the games. But the way it's presented, the Motorsport saga is just a very limited, over-glorified tutorial than anything right now. Other than this, you can pretty much create these scenarios in almost every game there is. The juiced games with their crew and betting systems, creating more personal stories between you and the rivals, all thanks to the simple implementation of its its betting mechanics. Flat out, with the carnage introduced in the midst of you and every named rival, every game has a story to tell even if they're not written by the developers. It's entirely up to you if you're willing to dig into it and whether or not the game has the mechanics to lead into it. And there are many examples to do something more than the average tournament arc. Even things as simple as background or character writing can really push investment into this fictional world. You don't even have to make it deep unless you're willing to commit. Just make it solid enough. I guess in the end, this just proves gameplay is the true king for these games, but that shouldn't take away what a good or bad story can do to a game. I'm sure there are many examples you've been thinking with this in mind. Games with good gameplay that you just can't stomach to finish because of the horrendous writing, or games with really bad gameplay that you're willing to beat multiple times just because of how much you love the stories and characters within. So we shouldn't underestimate the power of the script, but that should be enough for the rambling. Now it's time to turn the question to you. What are your thoughts on stories in racing games? Which type of stories do you prefer in a racing game? The direct approach, the lore book design, or are you the type to make or enjoy some crazy schizo stories in your head? Also, let me know which racing game do you think has the best story, especially if I didn't feature them here. What kind of hidden gems have you found in the wild? Because there's definitely a whole lot out there I still haven't even seen yet, and I'll see you in the next video.